So what is happening is that even within state schools now, we have an English medium section, or we have sort of streaming of students because there is an obsession with learning outcomes. So a multi-tiered system of education has been cemented in a sense, and which is really what the Indian public education system was meant to address, inequality itself, which Varghese called durable inequality in our last discussion. The curricular discourse, as I had also mentioned, was progressive in the middle of neoliberal reforms. And here was a school curriculum which tried to root ideas of social justice, diversity inside the curriculum, inside the textbooks, so that we look at quality around these issues. The RT Act was supposed to sort of back this up, and the National Curriculum for Teacher Education was to bring a confluence and a convergence between the school curriculum and teachers' development. But because we never had an institutional support for the RTE, because it was implemented by a project, never an institute. So that led to a whole host of other issues, because while the RTE started in 2010, we already had a huge shortfall of teachers and a cadre of untrained teachers. But after 5 years of the RTE, unfortunately, major amendments started weakening it even further. And right now we face a situation where right to education itself is now becoming right to learning alone, which means it really dismisses the larger context, purpose, goals of education that we are talking about, specifically in linking it up with sustainable development and sustainable societies. And this conceptual shift is actually enabling the new policy that we are now having in education to bring the RTE, which is a central legislation, in line minimalist idea of quality. So really we are effectively making it pretty defunct. I call the current education problematic the neoliberal cultural nationalist problematic, because ideas of cultural nationalism, which had threatened us several years ago also, but now they are pretty well aligned with the neoliberal learning outcomes and teacher performance kind of approach. And the further policy recommendation was his inside policy, which is still to be made official. I think it's almost there, that we need to make the RT Act even substantively sort of less restrictive, which means that it's going to open up a whole possibility of elementary education being provisioned by ideologically driven schools and institutions, and also profit-making enterprises. And the policy is, for the first time, very clearly articulating that it's children, individual children and their backgrounds, who are responsible for the learning crisis, completely dismissing structural inequalities which have been created because of unqualified para-teachers, vacancies, poor infrastructure, and so on. So there are sustained systems of neglect which we are going to be confronting as we think about transforming educational systems. I mean, over 10 lakh vacancies, the policy document itself acknowledges this, and the centrally sponsored scheme, which was able to create some space and financial allocations for teachers and for their support and for children's learning, has now come under one banner of Samagra Shiksha in 2018, which means further decline in resources. Already we can see that there's a decline from 29 to 2018-19 from 1.3% to 1.3%, 1.1%. But the states which have the largest number of professionally unqualified teachers are actually spending less than 1% of their budgets on teachers and their training and support. We are also, therefore, have been undermining the epistemic identity of teachers. So reforms have constructed very utilitarian notions of teachers, and it's almost like an anti-intellectual activity that we are perpetuating amongst our teachers. And they are trained to implement very minimalist agendas where practical knowledge is the only important thing to look at, and regulatory and curriculum frameworks have failed to address the local knowledges, languages, and all of that. And teachers, of course, have now been made complicit in fulfilling this minimalist agendas. What we also see is a wave of homogenizing and standardizing curriculum. In the policy, there's a clear mention of having an integrated B.Ed, which is going to be a single model to train teachers in foundational, preparatory, middle, and secondary levels, as if the levels of teaching do not have anything to do with the kind of knowledges we bring to teachers. And in doing this, the policy is obviously undermining the challenges of diverse and iniquitous classrooms. And the whole mal-regulation practices of both professional and higher education has deepened these challenges, and we find very little space for innovation in teaching, research, application of the kind of concerns that we are talking about for sustainable development. So uniformization is threatening to strengthen hegemonic knowledges that Madhulika was talking about in the previous session, and it's undermining the local knowledges, the subjugated knowledges, and deepening divides between theory practice. And interdisciplinarity is something we flagged in our last discussion, is very critical to questions of sustainability. So what are the steps towards transforming educational systems? We need to sort of argue and think together collectively on what we can do, but certainly at a systemic level, we have to challenge this shift that we see in policy, not only measures, but in the 2019 document, from the duty of the state to provide equitable quality education to the state becoming just a regulator, which is going to be dominated by private providers. So the hold of the state, as we discussed, is going to increase, but only by way of by regulating the dominant private providers that have come into the system in a big way. So we need to strengthen the role of public institutions, something that Verghese also talked about, how we need to bring public in the center once again, and develop a regulatory framework within RTE norms, which yet haven't been completely done away with, in order to halt the policy institutionalization of segregating the school and teacher education system, and of course, a clear regularization of all shades of private schools. And the mandate of the implementation of the Justice Verma Commission, which was a 2012 report that got completely glossed over and pushed under the carpet with the new political regime, I think there are very many lessons to learn from there. We have about 5 subcommittees, roadmaps waiting to be implemented, but nothing has happened so far. We are talking about enhancing institutional capacities of public and universities, institutions, and of course, arresting the mal-regulation that's happening, and undertake organizational restructuring of the NCTE, which was a special report that was put across by a task force, which again is gathering dust and nothing is happening. We need to emphasize the federal structure and the center-state cooperation, since this has been our legacy, because new policies threaten to create a common governance framework via Rashtriya Shiksha Ayog, which will control almost the microcosm of curricula and courses, choices, etc. We need to, of course, make immediate sizable investment and strengthen the government school and teacher education system, and envision curriculum that is rooted in equality, social, and gender justice. Just to quote that the challenge really that we have is to step away from the tacit narrative of NEP, because there's a lot of rhetoric in the policy document that it tends to confuse us. But the tacit narrative is that it's the duty of the child to learn. But I think we need to bring back to the established constitutional provision that it's the duty of the state to provide equitable quality education. Thank you very much.